Module 5, Preparing for Implementation of HACCP. And the aim of this unit is to prepare you for implementation. And by the end of this unit, you should be able to explain the main elements of the HACCP policy, explain the steps involved in the implementation of HACCP based on Codex Alimentarius, identify the need for a multidisciplinary approach when appointing the HACCP team, name the sources of information available to the HACCP team, describe the product, recipe, process, and state why it's important to identify the likely customers. So Codex implementation of HACCP, you need to assemble and train the HACCP team, define the terms of reference, scope of the study, describe the product, recipe, and process, identify the intended use of the product, construct a flow diagram, on-site validation of flow diagram, identify the hazards, risk, severity, and control measures for each hazard, which is principle 1. Determine critical control points using a decision tree, which is principle 2, which all ends up as HACCP, or is part of the HACCP process. So continuing, we need to establish critical limits for each critical control point, principle 3. Establish a monitoring system for each critical control point, principle 4. Establish corrective actions to be taken when a critical control point is out of control, that's principle 5. Establish verification procedures, which is principle 6. And lastly, establish documentation and record keeping, which is principle 7, and that gives us HACCP. Right, we need to assemble and train the HACCP team. Now, the HACCP team is a group of people with appropriate expertise who develop and implement the HACCP system. The size of the team must be proportionate to the size of the business. It must be multidisciplinary, so you need a representative from each department who can bring something different to the HACCP team. There must be adequate resources supplied. There must be team expertise. So the team must have knowledge of hazards, risks and controls, the technology of process, food microbiology, engineering and equipment, product characteristics and process, quality assurance, packaging and distribution, records, documentation and maintenance of those records and documents, and the team responsibilities. The sources of information can include coming from the HACCP team members. So like I said, it must be a multidisciplinary approach. Not one person is going to know all that information for the HACCP team. So there needs to be several team members. There must be consultants, laboratories and research organizations, or universities. They can be good sources of information. Public analysts, national food poisoning statistics, another good source of information, by attending seminars, following the codes or reading the codes of practice, listening and having chats with enforcement officers, having information from the Food Standards Agency, also the Health Protection Agency, trade associations, in-house experts, and more. We could have mathematical modelling, customers, suppliers, again, sources of information, customer complaints, television, radio, textbooks, magazines, libraries, and the internet. You need to define the terms of reference. So, for example, which hazards are you looking at with your system, with your business? Is it all three, microbiological, physical and chemical, or it might just be one or two? You need to decide on the scope. So which operation or process? Which products? Which steps including start and finish? So again, you've got various examples of the steps included. So you get from almost farm to fork. So you've got showing cattle there, going to a factory or to a place where they process the animal, which then goes to a butcher's shop, which then supplies the cafe. So farm, slaughterhouse, butchers, and cafe. You need to describe the product, recipe, process, and intended use. You need to look at the potential hazards and risks. You need to look at the raw ingredients and make sure they come from an approved supplier. You need to look at the suitability for bacterial multiplication of the product. The composition, the preservatives that the food contains, the pH, the acidity, the alkalinity, the AW, which is the water content, and the toxicity. The methods of processing or cooking, storage and distribution, the intended shelf life, packaging and label instructions, legal requirements, standards, allergies, for example, does it contain one of the 14 allergies, for example, nuts, sesame seeds, fish, etc. Intended storage temperatures, will the product be reheated? Is the reheating essential to destroy microorganisms? Will the food be eaten immediately after reheating? And what potential hazards will the food be exposed to? So what abuse potential is there? So generic grouping of food products, particularly important for catering and retailing. HACCP is based on each step from delivery through to service. HACCP of all products subject to similar process. For example, raw food, cooked, serve hot. All products prepared in a similar way can be grouped, for example, all items of bread or meat, pies or cakes, etc. So the key points of that section, we looked at the main elements of the HACCP policy, the steps involved in the implementation of HACCP based on Codex Alimentarius, the need for multidisciplinary approach when appointing the HACCP team, the sources of information available to the HACCP team, the product, recipe, process, and why is it important to identify the likely customers.